Good afternoon. Welcome to Nar Shalom in Jerusalem. I'm Avram Shira. We have a very interesting shiur today, a talk that's been developing over time. I'm calling it The Spark of the Messiah and the War in Azza. And we're going to find out what the connection is. An extremely important, deep concept. So, there is a principle in Kabbalah called Midah for Midah. Measure for measure, the highest light will go to the lowest place. Why? Because it takes the highest light to illuminate the darkest place. So we understand this principle. The higher the light, the farther it can go down into the darkest place. We're not talking about physical lights, obviously. We're talking about the awareness of the presence of the Creator. The farther a place is from that awareness, the higher the light of awareness there needs to be to illuminate the presence of the Creator. And so, with that concept in mind, let's go forward. That if we follow the history of the spark of the Messianic soul, because the Messianic soul is the carrier of that highest light of the awareness. As the great commentator Rashi tells us, that the original spirit of God, Ruach Elohim, Mirachefet al Pnei Hamayim, in the first verses of the Torah, the spirit of God hovered on the waters. That was early in the story, the primordial creation. That soul was already created. The highest light? Well, it must be pretty high because it's very close to the beginning, when all was completely one. And that soul will become the carrier of that highest light to the lowest place. And we see it very interestingly, for example, in this history of the Messianic spark, first by Lot. Abraham had divine inspiration, the patriarch, knew that his nephew contained within him the spark, or would come through him the spark of the Messiah. Only generations later, he knew it was not going to be tomorrow or the next day or the next 100 years, but the Messianic soul would be born through this line. The Zohar explains that God wanted a spark, the Jewish spark, to be connected with the spark of Moab, who would be one of the children born out of the illicit relations of Lot and his daughter. He had two daughters, and one called the son Moab. So he eventually founded a kingdom, because he has a spark of kingship from him through the family of Abraham. Because God promised Abraham and Sarah that kings would emerge from them, and that meant all over the globe, not just Jewish kings. So that spark of kingship, which is essentially, of course, what the Messiah is going to come through the line of Lot, who committed a seemingly heinous crime of getting drunk and committing incest. Can we get any lower than that? And you ask why? How could it be? How could the nephew of Abraham do that? Well, he was very drunk, and there are other reasons behind his psychological profile, shall we say. But the important for our discussion today is that there was a spark that needed to come, a kingship, through the low place. Why the low place? Because the other side would not put up a block when it came sin from other sin. See, because the Yetzer Hara, he's this prosecutor that goes around testing people. And he pushes too hard, and people sin. And that's one of the reasons why we say that in the future, in the end of the story, the evil will be wiped out completely, because he pushed too hard on humanity. He made it too hard to be righteous, It's not an excuse not to try. But God said, your job is to present the choice of unrighteousness as a test to people, but not to push them over the edge of the cliff of sin. So when sin comes out of sin, the evil inclination, the prosecutor doesn't pay attention. So it was able that the spark would enter Lot and his daughter through that original union. But it goes further. Later, we have the king Eglon of Moab, who was descended from that spark of Lot. He had a daughter named Ruth, and she was married into the family of Naomi, who was the wife of Elimelech, who was considered like the king of his time in the book of Judges. And so, at that time, Ruth connected to Boaz, who was considered the greatest judge of that generation. But how did she do it? She came back from exile, impoverished, unknown, unappreciated, a convert by virtue of her mother-in-law. And how does she get married to the 80-year-old greatest sage of the generation? She's a younger woman who can still have children. Well, Naomi gives her an advice to slip into his granary, essentially, where they would grind wheat, and sometimes the work was long, and so they would sleep over there. And this judge, this great man, had this granary. He was in charge of it. That's how he made a living, because people didn't make living from being judges then. People didn't make living from being leaders or politicians. They had a living. See, it's a very important principle in Judaism. You don't try to make your living on the people, whether you're a judge or a politician or whatever you are. As a servant, you're a servant. That means you do it from your heart and not from your desire to make an easy living. So Boaz, he was on the granary floor, and Naomi sent her Ruth into him in the middle of the night, which is considered immodest, number one. Number two, the people would find out about it and the immodest act and think that there was a sin involved. And number three, Boaz was the second in line to become her Yibumah, the wife of the dead brother, because he was in the family of her dead husband. And in Judaism, we have this concept that if a husband dies without having children, then the wife should marry his next in line brother, in order that the dead brother's soul will be reincarnated into the seed of his brother and his ex-wife. So it's one of the most arcane and perhaps mystical understandings of how God preserves the bloodlines of souls through the Levirate marriage, so that if a person dies without children, he's going to become the child of his own family and get a chance to do it again. Wonderful. That's why, but Boaz said, we can't do this in the middle of the night like this. I know who I am. I know what people will think. They're going to think something terrible is happening here, some sin. So he waited till the morning, and they did a proper marriage, and that removed the doubt. But you see, again, this spark that was carried through Ruth, who would become the great-grandmother of King David. She would live many years in the house of Yishai and David's father. And so then King David would become her great-grandson, and therefore the Messianic line came through the family of Ruth. And Boaz, again, it comes through this very dark, low place, through what's called some type of doubt of sin. And doubt of sin is enough to ruin somebody's reputation anyways. And so we see again, we follow this spark forward in time. Next place we see it appears through the tribe of Judah. Yehuda was one of the great brothers, of course, of the 12 brothers, the sons of Jacob. And he was going to be chosen to be the brother who would inherit kingship. And how did it happen? Well, he married his own daughter-in-law. Two of his sons married this particular woman, Tamar, and both of them died because they did improper things with their wife. And so the way Jewish law works in that situation is, if your daughter-in-law is married to your son and your son dies without children, then she has entitlement to marry the next brother in line. You see, it's another way of ensuring the security of the family and to give a place of power to the woman so that she's not left out on the street without a family to be married into. So she married the first brother, he died. She married the second brother, he died. And the third brother, like Judah, is like, no way, I'm not going to give her my third son. This is called Isha Katlanit, a deadly woman. And so he held back Shelah, his third son, and she knew that he was playing a trick, on the halacha, on the proper, the normal way of doing it. And so she dressed up like a prostitute and seduced him. But because of that union, this messianic line would continue on through another event, a very considered lowly event, to seduce your father-in-law in order to get pregnant. So one after the other, we see this principle taking place. The highest light, a nefesh, a soul of Mashiach, is coming through the lowest places, lowest events, I should say. The people themselves were tricked and fooled every time. And if you see throughout the Bible, everywhere you look, where there's a woman, there's a wisdom behind the scenes that Rivka told her son, Jacob, dress up like your brother so you can get the blessing. And it goes on and on and on throughout Jewish history. Why? Because the woman is called Malchut. She is the seat of Malchut, of kingship. And the Malchut will be carried on through the woman. Because we assign Jewish genealogy is passed on through a wife, through women. So you see, this kingship has to have this very subtle ability to hide and reveal. And this is not a new story, and we'll continue with it. But so after Lot, and after Naomi, and after Tamar, well, here comes the spark of Mashiach again, and this time it's going to be through Yishai and his wife, who gave birth to King David. But now there's a halachic doubt if King David really can be part of Am Yisrael, because his great-grandmother Ruth was from Moab, and we weren't allowed by the Torah to allow Moabites into the nation because they attacked us when we came out of Egypt. But there was a halachic question: did it mean that the Moabite men weren't allowed, or also the women? So that distinction in halakha was a problem for a long time. But here we got another doubt on this messianic soul. Can David be part of the line? And well, it brings up unpleasant memories, shall we say. And David was treated like an outsider as a young man, until the halakha was finally clarified by the prophet Shmuel. And when the prophet clarifies the halakha, nobody argues anymore, okay? So it took a while for that to happen. And then, well, it happened again. King David had many wives, had 18 essential wives, and each would have a child. And he was looking for who was going to be the next king. And he saw, in divine inspiration, that he had yet to marry the next queen that would give birth to Solomon, the next king. And he saw this woman bathing on the roof. And he had the divine inspiration. She's going to be the mother of the next king when I am gone. So when you're a king, this is a big deal, right? You pass the kingship on to the right guy, the right son. Because not every son is going to be perfect and righteous. And so, well, we know the story of Uriah, the wife of Bathsheba. He's the husband of Bathsheba, his wife. And King David saw Bathsheba on the roof. But technically, they were divorced because he was going out to war. And in Jewish warfare, all the husbands would give a divorce document on condition that he didn't come back. Because you didn't know when, back in the day, when they had these giant wars, people are running into each other at full speed with horses and swords and javelins and rock, who knows what else, right? A lot of people died each day in battle. And they didn't know if he was going to come back. So he gave Bathsheba, or he gave Bathsheba a get al Tanai, and he didn't come back. So technically, she was available, single, for King David to marry her, but King David interfered in the process a little bit. Uriah was a warrior, and he was a leader of other warriors, but King David had him placed in the front line of battle where there was a much greater chance of losing one's life. And the rabbi said this was not the way it should be, the spirit of the law, even though according to the letter of the law it was legal, according to the spirit of the law it was not. King David should have waited. So here's another question. How can Solomon be the next king if he came out of this situation? So, well, God punished King David and Bathsheba by their first child dying right after birth, and also by splitting his kingdom later. But again, this messianic soul, because King David built the temple. King Solomon built the temple, and he made world peace. So he really was the Messiah of his time, but he failed again with a test with his wives. And that's another question that we're not going to get into now, but the rabbis say he did not become Mashiach complete because he failed with this test with his wives. But we see over and over the same principle. The highest light, this histrionic soul called the Messiah, the anointed one, is going to come from the lowest places over and over. And we ask, well, wait a second. Doesn't the Yetzer Hara, doesn't the evil inclination, the angel of death, the great prosecutor that fell from heaven, doesn't he know these things that we've been talking about today? And you have to assume that he does. This is an angel. He's not a dummy, right? But there are principles about angels. One is they can never know anything higher than their own level. Whereas a tzaddik, a righteous person, or a righteous woman can know things that are much higher than her own soul. And we see it in this past week's parsha that Abraham, God said, how can I not do something without telling Abraham? And so you see that God's mind and Abraham's mind are one. And so you can know things that have yet to happen. You're going to know things that will happen in the past that the evil inclination will not always know all those things. And so this was why the greatest light has to come to the darkest place, because the evil inclination would not pay attention to where sin came out of sin. Because he's called an old foolish king. An old foolish king, he's getting tired. He's a king, but he's tired. And he's foolish because he overlooks things and makes mistakes in his job description, shall we say. And so with all of that said, we start to understand more why the highest light has to come in the lowest place, and why the great author of Pesichta Rabbati and Rav Hai Gaon, the great sage from over 1,000 years ago, said that when there is a war in all over the world between kings of all the nations, there will be a war on the day of Simchas Torah, which was this year. A war started with Azza. And at the end of this period, there's going to be a revelation of the Anointed One, this Messianic Spirit. So the lowest place was certainly Azza, perhaps the lowest place on earth, which does not surprise us because Abraham was given the land of the lowest people, the lowest tribes. The Hittites were snake worshippers who would sacrifice their children to the snake 4,000 years ago. This land was inhabited by the lowest people. The Canaanites were not just simple farmers. These people also ran to the temples of idol worship, which are essentially occult practices where they attempt to manipulate the forces of creation to get what they want, and aside from the will of God. So you see that this land was made from the lowest elements of human society, and Abraham and King David and all the other great sages from King Solomon, etc., they all had to come through this place because this is the lowest place where the highest light gets revealed. We're back to our original principle. And certainly after we see what the Gazans did on October 7th, we can't even look for a lower place on earth. And I don't know where you are and how much news you got about it, but I got enough to prove it, and I'm not going to repeat it through my mouth because it's too painful. And if you need to know what really happened, you can get it offline nowadays from the testimony and evidence of the investigators, from the Israeli army, and from the eyewitnesses that were there. And I had it from the eyewitnesses what was going on there. And it was beyond your imagination, and it was beyond Friday the 13th. You know, if you remember that horror movie, it was beyond any, high school shooting. What they did to the bodies and the babies and the old people. And that only tells us one thing, that the highest light is going to come out of this lowest event. And you have to believe that and hold on to it and know it with all your being, because God is fair and God loves us and God is with us. And he also is with anybody who is with us. So that you have free choice. Every nation must choose. Will they follow the Jews or not? And I bless all of you to make that right choice and to remember this principle, because it'll come up in your own life too. You will often see that the greatest things that happen to you come right after the darkest moments. And you know that old cliche, the greatest light is the dawn is after the night, right? And so too we see that in our lives. We see that as a nation. We see that as the human race, because we're about to enter a new realm, a new era of revelation of goodness that's going to obliterate evil. Now, it might take a day or two, maybe a little longer, but it's going to happen because it's promised, it was foreseen, and God does never, ever push away a positive prophecy. We have the power to push away the negative ones, but the positive prophecy, well, bring them on. We're here. God bless you all. Have a great day.